Hello and welcome to the Absolute Beginner Guitar Lesson Series. My name is Oliver and today's lesson is lesson number 10. The subject of today's lesson is triads. So what are triads? Triads are simply 3-note chords. There are four types of triads, and we're going to look at all four types. So I want to start out the lesson with a statement. And the first part of the statement is that chords are derived or created from major scales, and specifically from the root note parent, as I like to call it in quotes, major scale. The first type of triad I would like to look at is a C major triad. So we have the notes of our scale, and we have a C major scale here. There's a method we can use to derive the notes of our chords. And really quickly, the method involves taking the root note of the chord, which is the note the chord is named for, skipping over the next note of the scale, and then taking the following note of the scale, and then skipping over the next note of the scale and taking the following note. So using this method, we can derive a C major chord, and the notes that we get are C, E, and G. So those are the notes of our major chord, our C major chord. And right now what I'd like to do is I would like to perform an analysis of this chord with respect to the parent major scale of the root note. As we see here, C is the root note, and what I'm calling the parent major scale is the C major scale. So I hope that explains what I've been talking about. So if we analyze this chord, let's look at the first note C. The first note C is actually the first note in the scale. So I'm going to write down the number 1 just to show that the C is the first note in the C major scale. So we now have a C major chord, and as we can observe, the notes of the chord are the first note, the third note, and the fifth note of the C major scale. Now let's look at another major chord. And let's look at the F major chord. And for anyone who doesn't know the notes of the chord, we can derive the chord. We start with the F. So, as I stated at the beginning, I said that chords are derived from the root note parent major scale. Well, we have an F major chord here, and in the F major chord, F is the root note. So we need to look at what I call the parent major scale of this root note, which is the F major scale. So now let's analyze this F major chord with respect to the F major scale. So the F note is the first note in the scale. Our F major chord consists of the first, third, and fifth notes of the F major scale. And you may have recalled that our C major chord consisted of the first, third, and fifth notes of the C major chord. So what this reveals is a formula for deriving a major chord. And the formula is to take the first, third, and fifth notes of the major scale. So now we have derived the formula for a major triad. Let's look at minor chords. Let's look at the D minor chord. And if we use our little trick for deriving the notes of the chord, we come up with the note D, the note F, and the note A. So now we have our D minor chord. And in order to perform an analysis on this, we must analyze it with respect to the root note parent major scale. So now the root note of our chord is D. So we need to analyze this with respect to the D major scale. So now let's analyze this chord. As I stated before, the root note always comes from the first note of the scale. So that's 1. So now let's look at the F note. Well, if we look at our scale, there is no note F in the scale. However, the third note of the scale is F sharp. So now, in order for us to have F, we are going to have to alter this note. So we need to take this F sharp note and we need to make it into F. And for those who watched the previous lessons, they know by now that what we need to do is we need to take this F sharp note and flat it, creating the note F. So F sharp is the third note in the scale. And what we've done with the third note of the scale is we flatted the note. So now this F is referred to as the flatted third. And finally we have the A note. And as we can see, the A note is the fifth note of the scale. So we can see that the D minor chord consists of the first, the flatted third, and the fifth notes of the D major scale. This establishes a formula for a minor triad. So the formula for a minor triad is the first note, the flatted third note, and the fifth note of the scale. Now that we've looked at major chords and a minor chord, I'd like to do a comparison between the chords. So now let's compare the major and the minor chords. And instead of us writing out a bunch of different scales to compare various chords, what I'd like to do is I would like to compare these all with using the C major scale. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare chords that have C in the root note. First, let's look at the C major chord. Let's start with our formula. We know that the formula for a major chord is the first, the third, and the fifth notes of the root note parent major scale. So now let's derive that C major chord. So first thing we're going to do is take the first note of this scale. For this major triad, all the notes of the chord come directly from the major scale. So now let's look at the minor chord. So let's just compare these two chords. As I stated before, the C chord takes its notes directly from the major scale. So we have the first, the third, and the fifth notes of the major scale. Now if we look at this minor chord, I can see that in the minor chord we have the first note of the scale, and we also have the fifth note of the scale. However, we have the flatted third. The difference between a major triad and a minor triad is in the third. In the major triad, the third comes directly from the scale. The minor triad, the third needs to be altered. It needs to be flatted. So when we look at these two chords in comparison to each other, I hope that it becomes apparent that the only difference between the two chords is in the third. The next type of triad we're going to look at is the diminished triad. So let's go back to our C major scale. And we can derive the diminished chord by using that trick that I mentioned earlier. And we will come up with the notes B, D, and F. So now let's analyze this B diminished triad. When we look at this triad, one thing that becomes immediately apparent to me is the only note of the triad that's in the root notes major scale is the root note. The third has been altered and the fifth has been altered. So there's been a lot of changes and alterations to the notes of the scale. This establishes our formula for the diminished chord. I'm going to just tell you that the formula for the augmented triad, let me just write that over here, augmented. The formula for the augmented triad is the root, the third, and the sharp fifth. So let's start with the formula. Root, third, sharp fifth. Okay, so what I want to do now is to bring us back into familiar territory. I want to derive a C augmented triad. So now let me take a closer look at this triad. What I can see when I look at this triad is that this triad, the augmented triad, contains the first note of the root note parent major scale and the third note of the root note parent major scale. And the only note that has been changed or altered from the scale is the fifth, and we have the sharp 5. So now that we've looked at the various triads, I'd like to do sort of a comparison. So now when we do a side-by-side comparison, we can see that both chords contain the first and fifth notes of the scale. But the difference between the chords is in the third. And whereas in the major triad, the third comes directly from the scale, the minor triad, the third is flatted. And that is the only difference between the two triads. So next, let's take a look at the diminished triad. So now I want to compare our minor triads to our diminished triad. They both share the flatted third. Where they differ is in the fifth. And whereas the minor triad takes the fifth directly from the scale, the diminished triad alters the fifth. And finally, let's take a look at the augmented triad. So now let's do a comparison between the major triad and the augmented triad. Well, what I could easily see is that they both contain the root and the third, but we're not really concerned with the root. What we are concerned with is that both triads contain the third note of the scale. And where they differ is the augmented triad, instead of taking the fifth note of the scale, the note is altered to make it the sharp fifth note of the scale. So what I'd like to state is that because the major triad and the augmented triad both contain the third note of the root note parent major scale, in this case the E note. These chords or triads are major in nature. And on this side, the minor triad and the diminished triad both contain the flatted third. The note does not come directly from the scale. We have to alter the note to create the minor triad and the diminished triad as well. So these triads are minor in nature. In a nutshell, this is the basic fundamental information of the lesson. So we see that we have these formulas, which we sort of established and sort of proved out to ourselves. And that major and augmented chords are sort of major in nature because they both share the third note of the major scale, which is what really makes the major triad major. And minor and diminished chords are minor in nature because they both share the flatted third note of the scale, which essentially is what creates the minor triad. And I also want to let you know that there are times when substitutions can be made. For example, the augmented chord triad could be substituted for the major triad, and the diminished triad could be substituted for the minor triad. So put in your time, put in your work, and I hope to see you there. Peace.